I stopped praying when I became a Calvinist. Not all at once, it was gradual. I'd been raised to pray urgently, desperately, as if my prayers could move God's hand. I prayed for my unsaved friends by name. I prayed for healing. I prayed for provision. And I believed, really believed, that my prayers mattered, that God was listening and that He might act differently based on what I asked. Then I discovered Reformed theology, and suddenly prayer didn't make sense anymore. If God has ordained everything from eternity, if every event in history is part of His unchangeable decree, if He already knows what I need before I ask, then what is prayer? Is it just going through the motions, talking to a God who's already decided what He's going to do? I'm not alone in this. Thousands of Christians, especially young Reformed believers, struggle with prayer. The more convinced you become of God's sovereignty, the harder it becomes to pray with urgency. And on the other side, Arminians look at Calvinists and say, how can you even call that prayer? If God doesn't respond, if your words don't move Him, if He's just executing a script He wrote before time began, then you're not praying. You're reciting lines. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how Calvinists and Arminians think about prayer, why their views are so different, and how to navigate this tension in your own life. Because this isn't just theology. This is about whether the words you speak in your bedroom at night actually matter. Let's start with the Calvinist view of prayer, and to understand it, you need to understand the problem. If God has decreed everything that will happen, why pray? If He's already decided whether your friend will be saved, whether your sick parent will be healed, whether you'll get the job, then isn't prayer pointless? That's the objection, and it's a real one. Calvinists feel it. But here's how they answer it. Prayer is not about changing God's mind. It's about participating in God's ordained means. God doesn't just decree the ends, He decrees the means. And prayer is one of the means God has ordained to accomplish His purposes. Think of it this way. God decreed that you would eat dinner tonight, but He also decreed that you would prepare the meal. The preparation doesn't change the outcome, but it's still necessary. You can't say, well, God decreed I'll eat, so I won't cook. That's fatalism, not Calvinism. The same logic applies to prayer. God has decreed what will happen, but He has also ordained that prayer is the means by which some of those things come to pass. So when you pray, you are participating in God's plan. You're not changing it. You're fulfilling it. John Calvin himself wrote in the Institutes, "It is very absurd to say that prayer is superfluous because God's providence is always watching over our welfare. For the Lord Himself has determined that His people should exercise themselves in prayer. Indeed, He wills that His benefits be obtained by the entreaty of His people." Prayer is not optional, it's commanded, and God has ordained it as the mechanism through which He dispenses certain blessings. The Westminster Confession of Faith, chapter 5, paragraph 3 says this, "God in His ordinary providence makes use of means, yet is free to work without, above, and against them, at His pleasure." Prayer is a means. God ordains both the outcome and the means to that outcome. Prayer doesn't change God's decree, it executes it. R.C. Sproul explained it like this, "We pray because God commands it, because God promises to answer, and because prayer is a means God uses to accomplish His will." Does prayer change things? Of course it does. But what it changes is not God's mind. What it changes is the situation, because God has ordained that prayer be the means by which He brings about certain effects. So when a Calvinist prays for a sick friend, they're not trying to convince God to heal. They're asking God to do what He has already planned. If healing was part of God's decree, the prayer is the ordained means. If healing was not part of the decree, the prayer was still obedient. And either way, the Calvinist rests in sovereignty. God will do what is best. Prayer is not negotiation, it's submission. Now let me give you a Calvinist's prayer for an unsaved loved one. Notice the language. "Father, I know that salvation belongs to You. I know that if my brother is elect, You will save him. I pray that You would open his heart, that You would regenerate him, that You would draw him irresistibly to Christ, and if it is Your will, let my words, my witness, my life be the means You use. But Your will be done, not mine." The prayer is not, "God, please save him." The prayer is, "God, if You have decreed to save him, use me as the instrument. And if You have not, I submit to Your wisdom." That's Calvinist prayer, sovereign, submissive, confident that God is in control, but also aware that God's will might not align with what the person wants. John Piper writes, "Prayer is not a technique for getting my will done through God. It is the means appointed for getting God's will done through me. When I pray for someone's salvation, I am aligning myself with God's purposes. I am not trying to change his mind. I am asking to be used in his plan." Now here's the pastoral problem. For a lot of Calvinists, this kills urgency. If God has already decided, why pray desperately? Why plead? Why fast and weep and beg? And the answer from Reformed theologians is, because God commands it. Because even though you don't know the decree, you know the command. Pray without ceasing. Ask and it will be given. Seek and you will find. So you pray as if it matters, because in God's economy, it does. Not because it changes God, but because God has chosen to work through it. Charles Spurgeon, a staunch Calvinist, preached, "Prayer is the slender nerve that moveth the muscle of omnipotence." Spurgeon didn't mean prayer changes God. He meant prayer is the mechanism God uses to accomplish what he has already planned. The muscle was always going to move, but God ordained the nerve as the trigger. So for a Calvinist, prayer is real, it's meaningful, but it's not negotiation. It's participation in divine sovereignty. You pray because God told you to. You pray because it's the means he uses, and you rest knowing that whatever happens was ordained before the foundation of the world. Let me pause here and ask you something. If you're Calvinist, does this resonate? Does it make sense? Or does it feel hollow? If you're Arminian, does this sound like real prayer to you, or does it sound like play acting? Subscribe to this channel if you want content that wrestles with real questions instead of giving you Sunday school answers. And drop a comment. Tell me, do you struggle with prayer? Do you wonder if it makes a difference? Let's keep going, because the Arminian answer is completely different. Now let's put on Arminian lenses. And the first thing you need to know is that for an Arminian, the Calvinist view of prayer is not prayer at all. It's monologue. If God has already decided everything and your words can't change his mind, then you're not praying to a person. You're reading a script in a play where all the lines are already written. Real prayer from an Arminian perspective requires real relationship. And real relationship requires that both parties can affect the other. God affects you, but you can also affect God. Not in the sense that you control him, but in the sense that he listens, considers, and responds. Prayer is not executing a decree. It's asking a Father who can say yes or no based on what you ask. James 4 verse 2, "You do not have because you do not ask." That's the Arminian starting point. If you don't have something, it's because you didn't ask. Not because God didn't decree it, because you didn't ask. Prayer matters. It changes outcomes. Not because you're more powerful than God, but because God has chosen to make his actions contingent on your prayers. 1 John 5 verse 14, "And this is the confidence that we have toward him, that if we ask anything according to his will, he hears us." If we ask. The asking matters. God hears and responds based on what is asked. John Wesley wrote, "God does nothing but an answer to prayer." Even the creation of the world was an answer to the prayer of the Son. Wesley believed that prayer was not a formality. It was the primary mechanism by which God's will is done on earth. Not because God is passive, but because God has chosen to work in partnership with his people. Jacob Arminius argued, prayer is not only the means by which we obtain blessings from God, but it is also the means by which we move God to bestow those blessings. God is not a stone. He is a living, responsive, personal being who hears and acts based on the requests of his children. That's the key word, move. An Arminian believes you can move God, not manipulate him, not force him, but genuinely influence his actions through your prayers. Now let's apply this to the same scenario. An Arminian praying for an unsaved brother. Father, I know you love my brother. I know you desire his salvation. I know you've done everything necessary through the cross, but he hasn't believed yet. I'm asking you, please work in his heart. Please send people into his life who will share the gospel. Please convict him. Please draw him. And I believe that my prayers can make a difference. I believe that you might do something in response to this prayer that you wouldn't do otherwise. Save him, Father. Please. Notice the difference. This is not submission to a predetermined decree. This is petition. This is asking God to act and believing that God might act differently because of the asking. Roger Olson writes, Arminians believe that prayer is not merely a means God uses to accomplish what he has already unconditionally decided. Prayer is a genuine dialogue in which God invites us to participate in shaping the future. God has not decided everything in advance. He has left room for creaturely freedom, and that includes the freedom to ask and the possibility that God will grant what is asked. Now, here's where it gets deeply practical. An Arminian believes that some things happen because you prayed that would not have happened if you hadn't prayed. That's staggering. If you pray for your friend's salvation and they get saved, your prayer was part of the reason. God responded to your petition. If you don't pray and they don't get saved, your lack of prayer may have been a factor. That creates urgency, desperation. Wait, your prayers matter, not just as a formality, but as a real influence on real outcomes. James 5, verse 16. The prayer of a righteous person has great power as it is working. Power. Effectiveness. The prayer does something. It's not just aligning with a decree. It's accomplishing something that wouldn't happen otherwise. Here's how an Arminian reads the parable of the persistent widow in Luke 18. A widow keeps coming to an unjust judge, begging for justice. The judge doesn't care about God or people, but because she keeps bothering him, he grants her request. Jesus says, "And will not God give justice to his elect who cry to him day and night? Will he delay long over them? I tell you, he will give justice to them speedily." The point of the parable for an Arminian is that persistence in prayer moves God. The widow's persistence changed the judge's action, and Jesus compares that to how God responds to persistent prayer. God is not the unjust judge, but the principle holds: persistent prayer gets results. Now here's the Arminian critique of Calvinist prayer. If your prayers don't change anything, if God is just doing what he decreed, then why does Jesus tell you to persist? Why does he say ask, seek, knock? Why does he compare prayer to a son asking his father for bread? A son asks because he believes his father might give it. If the father has already decided whether or not to give it, the asking is theater. But Jesus treats prayer as real asking with real possibility of receiving. So for an Arminian, prayer is not submission to an unchangeable decree. It's participation in a dynamic relationship with a God who listens and responds. You pray because your prayers matter. You pray urgently because time is short. You pray desperately because souls are at stake. And you believe, truly believe, that God might do something because you asked that he wouldn't do if you didn't ask. Now, before we go deeper, let me ask you again. If you're Arminian, does this feel right? Does this capture what prayer is for you? If you're Calvinist, does this sound biblical, or does it sound like it makes God too dependent on us? Comment below. Tell me where you are. And make sure you're subscribed because we're about to get into the hard questions, the ones both sides struggle with. Let's get into the tensions, because both views create problems, and both sides have to wrestle with difficult realities. Tension number 1. Does prayer change God's mind? Calvinist answer: no. God's decree is eternal and unchangeable. He doesn't make decisions in time based on our prayers. He ordained from eternity what would happen, and he ordained prayer as the means. When you pray and God answers, it's not that he changed his mind. It's that he always planned to answer in response to the prayer he ordained you to make. Sounds circular? It is? But that's the Calvinist answer. Arminian answer: yes, prayer can change God's actions. Not his character, not his nature, but his decisions about specific situations. God is sovereign enough to choose to be responsive. He can hear a prayer and decide to act differently than he would have if the prayer hadn't been made. That's not weakness. That's relational sovereignty. A father can change his plans based on what his child asks without ceasing to be the father. Tension number 2. What about unanswered prayer? Calvinist answer: if your prayer wasn't answered, it wasn't part of God's decree. And God's decree is perfect. So even though you're disappointed, you can rest knowing that God's plan is better than what you asked for. Romans 8:28. All things work together for good. The unanswered prayer is part of the good. Arminian answer. If your prayer wasn't answered, God said no. Not because it was outside his decree, but because in his wisdom, he determined that granting the request wasn't best. God can say no. That's part of being a good father. But the asking was still real, and God genuinely considered it. Tension number 3. Should you pray for the salvation of specific people? Calvinists answer, yes, but with the understanding that if they're elect, God will save them, and if they're not, he won't. You don't know who the elect are, so you pray for everyone. And you trust that your prayers are the means God uses to save the elect. But you don't pray as if your prayer is the decisive factor. God's election is the decisive factor. Arminian answer. Absolutely. And your prayers can be the difference. God desires all to be saved, but he has given people free will. Your prayers can create opportunities, soften hearts, bring conviction. God might send someone into their life because you prayed. He might give them one more chance because you interceded. Pray desperately. Pray persistently. Pray as if their eternity depends on it, because in some sense, it might. Tension number 4. What about persistence in prayer? Calvinist answer. Persistence is obedience. Jesus commands it. So you persist. But you're not wearing God down. You're not changing his mind through sheer volume. You're demonstrating faith and submission. And God, who ordained the persistence, will answer in his time according to his decree. Arminian answer. Persistence moves God, not because he's reluctant, but because he values relationship and he wants you to demonstrate that you really want what you're asking for. The persistent widow changed the judge's mind. Jesus uses that as an analogy for how God responds to persistent prayer. Keep asking. Keep seeking. Keep knocking, because God responds to persistence. Tension number 5. Does prayer affect God emotionally? Calvinist answer. God is impassible. He doesn't change emotionally based on external circumstances. Your prayers don't make him happier or sadder. He ordained your prayers. He's pleased when you obey. But he's not emotionally moved in the way a human would be. His emotions, if we can even use that word, are part of his eternal decree. Arminian answer. Yes. God is affected by your prayers. He grieves when you don't pray. He rejoices when you do. He's moved by your tears. He responds to your pleas. God is not a stone. He's a father. And fathers are emotionally invested in their children's requests. When you pray, you're entering into real relationship with a God who genuinely cares about what you're saying. Now let's make this concrete. I'm going to give you 3 scenarios, and I want you to see how each system handles them. Scenario 1. Your mother is dying of cancer. You pray for healing. What are you actually doing? Calvinist answer. You're asking God to heal if it's his will. You know that God has already decided whether she'll be healed, but you also know that prayer is the means God uses. So you pray. You ask. You plead even. Not because you're changing God's mind, but because God commanded you to ask. And if healing was decreed, your prayer is part of the decree. If it wasn't, God's plan is still perfect. You can rest in that. Arminian answer. You're asking God to intervene. You believe that God can heal. You believe that your prayers might make a difference. You're not just submitting to a predetermined outcome. You're petitioning a Father who can say yes. And you pray urgently, desperately, because you believe that your prayer is part of whether she lives or dies. God might heal her because you asked. And that puts weight on your shoulders, but it also makes the prayer real. Scenario 2. Your son has walked away from the faith. He's 25. He's living with his girlfriend. He wants nothing to do with church. You've been praying for him for 5 years. What does your prayer sound like? Calvinist prayer. Father, I don't know if my son is elect, but I trust your sovereignty. If you have chosen him, I know you will bring him back. I pray that you would use whatever means necessary. Break him if you have to. Convict him. Regenerate his heart. And if I am part of your plan, use me. But if he is not elect, I submit to your wisdom. Your ways are higher than mine. I will keep praying because you commanded it, but I rest knowing that you are in control. Arminian prayer. Father, I know you love my son. I know you desire his salvation. I'm begging you, please don't give up on him. Please keep working. Please send people into his life. Please convict him every time he tries to run. I know he has free will. I know he can reject you, but please don't let him. I believe my prayers can make a difference. So I'm going to keep praying every single day until he comes home or until you tell me to stop. Please, Father, save my son. Do you see the difference? One is submission. The other is petition. One trusts the decree. The other trusts the relationship, and both believe they're praying biblically. Scenario 3. You're praying for a job. You've been unemployed for 6 months. Bills are piling up. You need this job. What do you pray? Calvinist prayer. Father, I need provision. I trust that you have ordained what will happen. If this job is part of your plan, I thank you in advance. If it's not, I trust that you have something better. I submit to your will. Give me peace to rest in your sovereignty while I wait. Arminian prayer. Father, I need this job. I'm asking you, please open this door. I believe you can. I believe you want to provide for me. I'm trusting that you'll make a way, and I'm asking you to act. Please give me this job. I believe my asking matters, so I'm asking. One prayer sounds peaceful, the other sounds desperate. One rests in the decree, the other wrestles with God, and both prayers would say theirs is the biblical model. I want to stop here and let you sit with this. Because here's the thing, I've given you both sides as clearly as I can. I've quoted Calvin and Spurgeon and Piper. I've quoted Wesley and Arminius and Olson. I've walked through the logic and the scripture. And the truth is, both systems are trying to be faithful. Both are trying to honor God. But they produce radically different prayer lives, and you have to decide which one you believe. Does your prayer change anything, or is it just the means God uses to do what he already decided? Drop a comment and tell me, where do you land? And if this is helpful, subscribe. Because we're going to keep digging into these questions, let me close with a confession. I don't have this figured out. I've been a Christian for over 20 years. I've prayed through both frameworks, and I still don't know with absolute certainty what prayer is. But here's what I do know. Prayer is commanded. Jesus prayed, the apostles prayed, the early church prayed, and if the Son of God who knew the Father's will perfectly still prayed, then prayer is not optional for me. So I pray. I don't always know if I'm changing God's mind or participating in his decree. I don't always feel like my prayers matter. Sometimes they feel like words disappearing into the void, but I keep praying because I'm commanded to. Because somewhere, deep down, I believe that the God who tells me to ask is also the God who listens. If you're Calvinist and you've lost the urgency to pray, let me challenge you. The fact that God ordained the outcome doesn't mean he didn't ordain your prayer as the means. So pray. Pray desperately. Pray as if it matters. Because in God's economy, it does. If you're Arminian and you're carrying the weight of thinking every unanswered prayer is your fault, let me give you permission to rest. You're not responsible for outcomes. You're responsible for obedience. Pray, ask, seek, knock, and trust that God in his wisdom knows what's best even when he says no. And if you're somewhere in between, unsure of which system is right, let me give you freedom. You don't have to resolve this perfectly to pray faithfully. Pray with whatever theology you have. God is big enough to receive your prayers even if your systematic theology isn't perfect. He's not grading you on whether you're Calvinist or Arminian. He's listening to his child, and that's enough. So close this video and go pray. Pray for someone you love. Pray for something you need. Pray even if you don't know whether it changes anything. Pray because you were told to, and trust that the God who hears is also the God who cares. Whether your prayer executes a decree or moves a father's heart, it matters. Because he said it does, and that's enough.